Brace yourself for a radical claim that defies everything conventional society has drilled into your mind. People talk about a hidden segment of our population, individuals who appear fully human but lack genuine consciousness, real self-awareness, or any spark of spirit. They're often labeled non-player characters, backdrop people, or even soulless. Throughout history, these accounts have lurked in obscure manuscripts, esoteric texts, and clandestine circles, dismissed as paranoid speculation or outright heresy. Yet the deeper you dive into this bizarre narrative, the more unsettling it becomes. Some ancient writers, secretive mystical orders, and cutting-edge theorists all converge on a single explosive idea: maybe not everyone around us is truly awake. In certain Gnostic writings, fragments discovered among the Nag Hammadi scriptures, there's a jarring hint of categories within humanity: those imbued with divine spirit, those partially aware, and those who remain locked in pure material existence. Instead of calling them soulless, these texts describe them as being stripped of the higher spark, bound to the physical realm with no real capacity for spiritual enlightenment. Scholars argue about whether the Gnostics were literal or symbolic, but a handful of researchers interpret these references as proof that a sizable number of people are simply fillers in our shared reality. Evidence isn't confined to ancient theology. Hermetic treatises, likewise, propose that certain individuals possess only the lowest rung of consciousness, missing the crucial ingredient that grants true self-awareness. And in Kabbalistic thought, the idea of a divine soul is considered a privilege not automatically granted to every entity walking the earth. Again, mainstream discussions tend to gloss over these details, preferring a neat narrative that everyone is equal in spiritual potential. Critics of that neat narrative point to these cryptic texts and claim they're glimpses of a truth we've collectively repressed for centuries. Modern parallels can be found in the realm of philosophy. David Chalmers' concept of philosophical zombies posits a hypothetical being that behaves exactly like a human but lacks subjective experience. While academics use it to debate the nature of consciousness, more fringe voices co-opt it to bolster the NPC hypothesis. They insist these zombies are not merely a hypothetical tool, but an unspoken reality, a hidden class of people operating on autopilot without genuine interiority. This notion grates against mainstream psychology and neuroscience, but it keeps surfacing in countless forums, alternative research groups, and conspiratorial subcultures. Skeptics demand verifiable proof, yet there's a historical pattern of authority suppressing anything that threatens established order. Look at the persistent hush around certain Dead Sea Scroll fragments, the under-the-table scholarly debates on apocryphal gospels, or the centuries of conflict between mystics and orthodoxy. Some claim that revelations about soulless people got buried under official dogma, partly to maintain social harmony, partly to protect powerful institutions. Others assert that the entire NPC narrative is just a modern reinterpretation of ancient allegories meant to highlight spiritual ignorance rather than literal soullessness. Now let's crack open the dusty vault of ancient writings that rarely see the spotlight, because while mainstream sources love quoting the same handful of well-known texts, entire corridors of esoteric lore remain overlooked. Picture vast libraries containing scrolls and tablets that hint at a hidden subclass of humanity whose spirit, if it exists at all, is disturbingly hollow. Ancient Mesopotamian myths, for instance, describe the gods fashioning humans from clay, then selectively bestowing something akin to a vital essence. Most references focus on shaping mortal workers for the gods, but scattered lines in some translations allude to figures created without that full infusion of divine breath, essentially living tools rather than fully realized humans. Researchers argue whether these passages are literal or allegorical, but they keep popping up in lesser-known cuneiform fragments catalogued in archives around the world. In the labyrinth of Egyptian spirituality, we see a complex map of the soul, Ka, Ba, Ib, and so on. Standard Egyptology frames these as components that together form a complete individual. Yet certain funerary spells suggest there were those who never received the essential spark required to journey through the duat, the realm of the dead. A handful of fringe Egyptologists point to specific lines in mortuary texts detailing empty vessels that neither pass to the afterlife nor remain as hauntings. They vanish from the cosmic cycle, absent the Ka or Ba that would anchor them in the spiritual plane. While mainstream scholars usually dismiss these references as metaphorical, alternative researchers interpret them as evidence of a recognized phenomenon, beings that look human but fundamentally lack a critical piece of consciousness. Babylonian epics also fuel the discussion. Texts from the library of Ashurbanipal, though partially damaged, contain stories about artificially created servants, sometimes described as shadows in flesh, or puppets of the gods. In mainstream academic circles, these passages are often explained as mythic preludes to the creation of humankind in general. But some fringe investigators believe there's a distinction between genuine humans endowed with independent will and facsimiles that follow routine commands. One translation references an entire assembly that existed merely to crowd the courts of divine rulers, performing mechanical tasks without any personal drive. Kabbalistic writings add yet another twist to the narrative. While many are aware of the concept of the golem, an artificial figure brought to life through mystical rites, fewer people realize that older layers of Jewish esoteric tradition imply the possibility of humans born lacking a full connection to the nefesh, the life force, ruach, emotional mind, or neshama, the highest spiritual soul. Some texts suggest these individuals might remain locked in a lower state, never ascending to deeper levels of awareness. Scholars within Hasidic and other mystical streams typically interpret these gradations as stages of spiritual development, not as absolute categories of soulless versus ensouled. However, certain Kabbalistic commentaries do hint at a permanent deficiency for some, raising the question of whether everyone truly carries a complete spark of the divine, or whether some are living placeholders. Little-known early Christian apocrypha add more fuel to the fire. Texts that never made it into the official canon sometimes recount stories of Jesus or the apostles encountering crowds of people who remain oblivious to divine truths, not just out of stubbornness, but because they have no internal capacity for faith. A few tantalizing lines from the infancy Gospels, for example, describe empty hearts that cannot house the Spirit, an image overshadowed by the grander miracles typically highlighted in theological debates. Modern analysts who delve into these obscure passages claim they're talking about literal voids, a condition akin to being physically alive but spiritually inert. Greek and Roman mystery cults leave fragments too. The Orphic tradition famously discusses the transmigration of souls, yet there's mention of those who never truly possessed a soul to begin with. It's murky, hidden behind layers of cryptic hymns and allegories. Devotees had to undergo initiations, sometimes reenacting mythical journeys from death to rebirth. If you dig into certain Orphic hymns, you'll find passages about beings who walk among men yet remain excluded from the cycle of rebirth because there's nothing to recycle. These lines rarely make it into mainstream classics courses, but they resonate with the idea of an empty shell moving through life, ignorant of any higher calling. Similar references surface in the Persian Zoroastrian tradition, though typically overshadowed by the main dualistic struggle between Ahura Mazda and Angra Mainyu. Some lesser-studied Zand or Pahlavi texts allude to a category of individuals who serve the lie by default, not because they've chosen evil, but because they lack the moral and spiritual essence to align with truth. Again, translators often consider this poetic flourish. Yet contemporary esoteric circles seize on these phrases, suggesting that ancient magi recognized a segment of humanity that's simply going through the motions, playing a part without any real interior life. Picture a bustling city street full of folks heading to work. Each person seems animated, engaged, and reactive to the world around them. Yet certain theorists argue that some of them might just be philosophical zombies, individuals indistinguishable from regular humans on the outside but lacking genuine inner experience. This notion became an academic lightning rod when analytic philosophers started asking whether it's logically possible for a being to mimic every outward sign of consciousness, language, problem-solving, even emotional expressions, without any subjective awareness behind the scenes. David Chalmers' discussions on the hard problem of consciousness ignited much of this debate. He pointed out that no matter how precisely you map a brain's physical processes, you still face an explanatory gap. Why do certain physical events produce an actual felt experience? Philosophical zombies directly confront that question. If a hypothetical creature can go through all the motions of being human without having any conscious sensation, no genuine pain when poked, no authentic joy when praised, then it reveals a gaping hole in our current understanding of how mind relates to matter. many academic philosophers reject the possibility of zombies, labeling it an extravagant thought experiment. They lean on materialist theories, insisting that consciousness is inseparable from certain neural configurations. Others disagree, maintaining that the concept of a zombie highlights how we might never fully prove another person is conscious. In everyday life, people rely on empathy, language, and consistent behaviors to assume everyone else is lit up inside. Philosophical zombie theory tosses a wrench in that assumption, fueling speculation that a portion of the population could be going through life without ever experiencing real qualia, those raw feels that color every waking moment. Some link philosophical zombies to certain psychological phenomena where individuals display a shocking lack of interiority, possibly due to neurological anomalies or dissociative conditions. There are documented cases of patients describing states that sound eerily zombie-like, lacking personal insight or an inner monologue. Philosophical purists might protest that such clinical examples don't fully line up with the zombie scenario, but the parallels remain striking enough to raise eyebrows. Other corners of philosophy of mind add further layers to the mystery. Daniel Dennett's arguments about consciousness as a user illusion challenge the idea that there's any deep, irreducible essence behind thought. In contrast, proponents of panpsychism suggest that consciousness infuses all matter in some form, rendering the zombie concept moot. While these theories conflict, they share a fascination with the possibility that conscious awareness isn't universal, even in creatures that look like us. Neuroscience labs have chipped in, too. Research on split-brain patients, locked-in syndrome, and advanced brain imaging sometimes yields clues about how consciousness arises, or fails to. Nobody has demonstrated a zombie in the lab, but experiments revealing blind sight or illusions of will nudge us closer to understanding whether it's possible for complex behavior to unfold without genuine subjective experience. Philosophical zombies remain a mental exercise, but these oddities in neuroscience give the conversation real-world traction. Legends from across the globe contain peculiar references to beings that appear human but lack a crucial inner spark. Haitian Vodou, for instance, describes the zombie as a person resurrected or controlled through sorcery. Popular culture often dilutes the concept into a mindless corpse, but deeper Vodou traditions emphasize that certain zombies don't simply lose their free will, they're missing an essential component that once connected them to the higher realms of consciousness. Local lore indicates that the Boka, sorcerer, traps or removes a person's T-bon Anji, one aspect of the soul, leaving the body functional yet spiritually hollow. Some anthropologists propose that these accounts are metaphors for social control or references to drug-induced compliance. Yet plenty of local practitioners maintain that a genuine process rips away an inner essence, turning the individual into a vessel deprived of higher awareness. In Celtic folklore, stories of changelings paint another unsettling image. A fairy, or other supernatural entity, allegedly swaps a human child with a substitute that appears the same but lacks a true human soul. Various folk remedies and tests supposedly exposed these imposters, leading to severe outcomes for children suspected of being changelings. While modern explanations lean on developmental disorders or misunderstanding of illnesses, older texts portray changelings as animated copies that merely imitate typical human behavior. Certain Irish and Scottish tales stress that these substitutes display off-kilter reactions, can't develop normal empathy, and remain under the sway of otherworldly masters. Contemporary readings see them as cautionary tales, but the older narratives insist that a changeling is literally missing the essential spark that defines a real human child. Japanese folklore features strange entities called tsukumagami, household objects that gain a form of sentience after 100 years. Although many depict them with quirky personalities, some stories describe them as shells possessed by wandering spirits lacking a true self. In those accounts, the object moves and interacts, but shows no sign of an internal consciousness or moral compass. Similar distinctions appear in tales of yokai that mimic human forms. Certain shapeshifters like the Noprabi appear human from a distance but reveal a featureless face, hinting at the possibility of an external shell with no real essence inside. While most see these creatures as pure myth, a fraction of researchers connect them to older Shinto beliefs about animism and spiritual occupancy, suggesting that some entities manifest physically but carry no genuine human consciousness. West African and Afro-Caribbean traditions also feature spirits or jinn that occupy uninhabited vessels. Oral histories in parts of Senegal or Mali describe borrowed bodies used by wandering entities that can't reincarnate. Instead of receiving a standard birth and soul, these bodies act as placeholders until the entity finally departs. This scenario differs from straightforward possession tales, where a normal person is overtaken. Instead, the narrative implies that a body was vacant from the start, ready to be used by an external force. Some local law compares it to having a house without a permanent resident. The structure stands intact, but there's no genuine occupant driving free will or authentic emotion. Certain Native American stories also flirt with the concept of soulless beings. A few tribes refer to blank ones or hollow men, individuals who appear normal yet exude an unsettling emptiness in communal gatherings. Tribal elders in these stories often treat them as omens or bad medicine. While some anthropologists interpret these accounts as allegories of lost identity or disconnection from tradition, old storytellers suggest a literal absence of the spiritual essence required to share in communal rites. The blank one might speak and move like everyone else, but it doesn't form the genuine bond of spirit that unites the tribe. Several modern researchers catalogue these tales to highlight shared motifs: the removal or absence of a core soul, a body that functions but lacks the internal flame, or an external force animating something otherwise dormant. The question arises whether each culture independently invented a similar metaphor, or if they're describing a phenomenon that different societies interpreted through their own spiritual frameworks. Listen up, because this next angle cranks the intensity to a whole new level. There's a theory floating around that everything you see, your house, your job, the sky, and even the people you chat with, could be part of a massive programmed environment. We're talking about simulation theory, the brainchild of thinkers who argue our entire reality might be an advanced simulation engineered by a hyper-intelligent civilization. Under this paradigm, the notion of backdrop people, or NPCs, becomes more than just a side note. It fits right into a scenario where not everyone you interact with is a fully conscious participant. Some could be sophisticated background code, designed to fill out the environment much like computer-controlled characters in your favorite video game. Much of the hype around simulation theory stems from a famous thought experiment. If civilizations continue advancing technologically, it's plausible they'll develop simulations so intricate that the simulated entities believe they're in a real, organic world. Proponents say the odds are ridiculously high that we're already in one. Here's the kicker: if that's the case, not every character needs to be rendered with the same level of detail. Just like in a game, certain characters have high-resolution features when the player interacts with them, while others remain in a simplified form until they are needed. Extrapolate that idea, and you've got a blueprint for how backdrop peoples might function within a simulated reality, perfectly lifelike on the surface, but lacking any real consciousness because the code doesn't demand it. Glitches in the system often come up in these conversations. You've probably heard stories: someone observes a bird frozen mid-flight, or sees two identical strangers with matching outfits and mannerisms standing right next to each other, oblivious. Online forums brim with photos and videos where reality seems to momentarily falter. Most of these get dismissed as hoaxes or camera errors, but simulation theory enthusiasts see them as cracks in the facade. They argue that real conscious players notice these anomalies, while NPCs remain untroubled, carrying on their routine as if nothing happened. It's reminiscent of a video game crowd. They look busy at first glance, but pay closer attention and you notice they loop the same limited actions or dialogues. Another phenomenon linked to this conversation is the Mandela effect, where large groups of people remember an event or detail differently than how it's documented today. Some say it's just the malleability of human memory, but others see it as evidence of software updates to the simulation. Backdrop people adapt seamlessly, while a handful of conscious observers recall the previous version. This concept gets amplified by modern-day speculation about quantum computing and parallel realities. Some fans of the simulation idea argue that these odd memory discrepancies hint that we might be witnessing system-wide changes in real time. Then there's the question of how advanced a civilization needs to be to run a simulation of this scale. Advocates of the theory point out that our own technology is racing forward. Virtual reality, artificial intelligence, and procedural generation are just scratching the surface. If our future selves or some alien intelligence created these simulations, they could orchestrate entire digital universes with billions of simulated individuals, only a fraction of whom would need authentic consciousness. Backdrop people become resource-saving measures. They fill the environment with realistic behavior, never requiring the complexity or processing power that conscious minds would demand. Critics balk, insisting this all sounds like a sci-fi fever dream. Yet the simulation concept has been championed by certain high-profile tech and science influencers, fueling public fascination. When you combine the speculation around advanced computing power with the idea that not everyone we see is truly awake, you get a potent blend of suspicion and wonder. The theory resonates with those who sense something off about daily life, who feel that certain individuals seem a bit too mechanical, unperturbed, and caught in repetitive cycles. Eastern spiritual traditions contribute a whole different flavor to the idea that not every human being is endowed with the same level, or even the same kind, of conscious essence. Rather than framing it as a question of soul versus soulless, many Eastern teachings describe layers or gradations of awareness, implying that some individuals barely register beyond the material plane. In certain branches of Hindu philosophy, there's a focus on the interplay between Purusha, pure consciousness, and Prakriti, material nature. While general interpretations insist every human has an Atman, the eternal soul, minority commentaries suggest that some beings never attain a realization of this inner self, effectively functioning on autopilot within Prakriti. They might follow rituals, social norms, and biological imperatives without accessing the deeper layers of consciousness. Those who champion radical readings of these texts argue that it points to the possibility that a fraction of humanity remains locked in a purely mechanistic state, no genuine connection to the higher self. Buddhist thought complicates the picture further by teaching anatta, no permanent self. Mainstream Buddhist practice emphasizes that what we call a self is an illusion arising from fluctuating aggregates, form, sensation, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. Yet there are meditative traditions within certain sects that highlight variations in how these aggregates manifest from one person to another. A few monastic accounts speculate that while most individuals possess a dynamic interplay of these aggregates, a smaller subset may operate with severely diminished awareness, lacking the capacity for genuine insight. Though most Buddhist teachers would explain this as a temporary condition tied to karma or ignorance, some fringe interpreters claim it's permanent for certain shell personalities who never truly experience any form of enlightenment or even the potential for it. Taoist teachings introduce the concepts of Shen, spirit, Jing, essence, and Qi, energy. Standard Taoist practices aim to balance these three treasures, believing that a disharmony can lead to spiritual dullness or emptiness. Yet older texts, especially in certain alchemical traditions, sometimes speak of individuals with incomplete or fragmented Shen, resulting in a life lived at surface level, with minimal genuine vitality or spiritual awareness. It's not labeled as soullessness in the Western sense, but the end effect can appear alarmingly similar: a person who goes through motions, eats, sleeps, and interacts, yet fails to display the spark that comes from integrating mind, body, and spirit. Some esoteric lines of Taoism go so far as to suggest that these incomplete souls can be manipulated by external forces, be they malevolent spirits or cunning masters versed in advanced energy work. In Chinese folk belief, the concept of Hun and Po also adds an intriguing angle. Hun is often translated as the young spirit, the part that can ascend or connect to the higher realms, while Po represents the yin spirit, tied more directly to the body and material life. Most people are believed to have multiple aspects of both Hun and Po, which must stay balanced. Certain old stories discuss shell individuals missing key components, leaving them with only the Po side. They remain biologically alive and socially functional, but they lack the refined consciousness that Hun provides. Such tales are rarely spotlighted in mainstream discourse, yet they echo the idea of a partial or absent spiritual presence. In Japan, advanced Zen teachings delve into how far one can strip away the constructs of self to reach Satori. Despite the popular image of Zen emphasizing emptiness in a positive, liberating sense, older scrolls mention practitioners who observed fellow monks reciting sutras and performing tasks with no genuine interior realization, more like rote performers. Some Zen masters refer to these monks as living ghosts, suggesting they were physically present but spiritually void. It wasn't a condemnation, rather, it highlighted the difference between outward form and genuine inner awakening. Modern Zen scholarship usually frames this as a temporary state of ignorance, but a minority of texts imply that some never break through. Paranormal investigators sometimes join forces with amateur psychologists and self-styled researchers to gather case studies. They comb through first-person accounts of uncanny behavior and catalog recurring traits. Some revolve around the idea that a real human, when pressed with intense emotion, whether grief, excitement, or anger, displays at least some spontaneous reaction. Yet these empty people allegedly follow a script, responding only with surface-level words that lack genuine emotional weight. A handful of experimenters claim to have tested friends or relatives by sharing shocking news, a death in the family, a sudden job loss, and observed that the individual offered textbook sympathy lines but failed to convey any authentic emotional resonance. One repeated sign, an odd delay before replying, as though searching for the correct social script. Mediums and energy workers add another angle. They speak of an aura or life force field that most humans exhibit. These practitioners describe scanning sessions where nearly everyone shows distinctive energy patterns, swirling colors, or vibrational frequencies. But once in a while, they claim to encounter a person whose energetic signature is either missing or disturbingly static. According to these accounts, that NPCs might be in good physical health, hold down a job, and socialize normally, yet produce none of the expected energetic fluctuations tied to thought or emotion. While mainstream science dismisses aura reading as subjective at best, it hasn't stopped alternative communities from building entire databases of these unusual cases. Some meditation teachers also report encountering individuals who simply cannot engage in deeper introspection, no matter how many hours they log on the cushion. They say most students, after sufficient practice, begin reporting subtle internal shifts, new insights, or emotional clarity. Yet there are outliers who consistently return with nothing, no sense of expanded awareness, no glimpses of altered consciousness, zero introspective progress. Seasoned instructors sometimes confess privately that they suspect these students aren't capable of genuine self-inquiry. Rather than drifting into a quiet mind state, they seem to maintain a superficial mimicry of meditative postures and breathing techniques, without ever experiencing the transformative spark that defines contemplative work. A few fringe psychiatrists have weighed in, noting that personality disorders or severe dissociation can lead to hollow effect or mechanical responses. But proponents of the soulless theory argue that the phenomenon runs deeper than any diagnostic label. They point out that many so-called NPCs function just fine in society, hold polite conversations, and pass basic empathy checks, yet something essential is absent. Researchers who track these testimonies propose that the missing piece isn't an emotional response or high IQ, but the interior observer that most people identify as of me. It's as if these individuals can talk about themselves yet have no real self to speak of. One sticking point that keeps sparking arguments in niche forums and scholarly side discussions is how the idea of NPCs or soulless peoples might affect ethical principles and social hierarchy. Critics contend that labeling anyone as lacking a soul runs the risk of creating dehumanizing attitudes. They argue that, historically, whenever a group was deemed lesser, the result tended to be discrimination or exploitation. Proponents of the NPC concept shoot back, claiming they don't endorse discrimination but merely want to highlight an unsettling phenomenon that's been hinted at in ancient texts, alternative spiritual teachings, and modern anecdotal evidence. They see it as a puzzle worth studying rather than a tool for dividing society. Some on the more radical end of the spectrum suggest that behind closed doors, certain secret orders or elite circles have always understood the presence of these backdrop people and used them to manage social structures. They'll point to centuries-old conspiracies, from hidden councils in Renaissance Europe to rumored modern think tanks, alleging that the same blueprint carries forward, an inner circle that manipulates the majority, aware that some portion of that majority is pre-programmed to follow. Historians typically write off those claims as sensational or lacking solid proof. Still, that doesn't stop a steady stream of blog posts, leaked documents, or cryptic interviews fueling speculation about advanced knowledge of a subset of individuals who never question deeper realities. Another flashpoint is whether mainstream science might eventually weigh in with formal research. Critics say the notion of soullessness or lack of consciousness is too vague to measure experimentally. They argue that real neuroscience demands quantifiable data, not intangible spiritual assumptions. Meanwhile, a small group of independent researchers tries to design tests, maybe advanced neural imaging protocols or detailed personality metrics, that could, in theory, detect an absence of subjective awareness. Thus far, no mainstream study has openly tackled the hypothesis that a percentage of the population might be operating without authentic self-awareness. The stigma attached to the idea probably doesn't help. Some individuals who believe they've encountered NPCs attempt to compile large-scale surveys, capturing subtle signs, limited emotional range, repetitive verbal patterns, absence of creative thinking, or a peculiar inability to discuss existential topics. They collect interview responses, publish them on forums, and pick apart the data looking for statistical trends. But because these investigations lack academic oversight, the results rarely pass peer review. Journalists who stumble upon these projects often dismiss them as conspiracy-laced rumors. Yet the underground movement persists, driven by personal conviction and ongoing anecdotal reports that something's missing in a chunk of humanity. Online, the debate sees daily fireworks. Some participants are everyday people who sense anomalies in their coworker, neighbor, or even a family member. Others come from a more philosophical angle, weaving the threads of ancient mysticism, computational theory, and fringe psychology into a big tapestry that points to a literal hollow segment of society. In these digital battlegrounds, skepticism meets fervor head-on. You'll find heated arguments over whether entire institutions, governments, corporations, religious bodies rely on the presence of NPCs to maintain control. You'll also encounter calmer voices who are just intrigued, wanting to figure out if any real data supports these claims, or if it's all an elaborate fiction. Some watchers of this phenomenon notice parallels to the older fear of automata or robots taking human form, a timeless dread that not everyone who appears sentient truly is. People draw links to classic sci-fi, from silent mechanical men in old novels to modern android fantasies that question the essence of being human. The difference, according to NPC believers, is that what used to be fiction might actually walk among us, hidden by routine interactions that don't demand deeper introspection. All these discussions, whether they spark outrage or fascination, underscore an enduring mystery. Does everyone around us share the same rich inner life, or are some individuals only performing the role of a fully conscious human? It's the kind of question that can't be settled by a quick poll or a casual experiment. Yet it remains a gripping possibility that refuses to disappear, circulating through ancient manuscripts, mystical teachings, simulation hypotheses, philosophical debates, and countless personal encounters that raise eyebrows. Thank you so much for sticking with me until the very end of this video. Your time and attention mean a lot, and I appreciate you joining me on this deep dive into such an elusive and provocative topic. Stay curious, stay sharp, and I'll catch you in the next one.